makes it slightly different from some of the other sessions. It's traditional at this point to say, well, the speakers need no introduction. I'm not going to say that. But what I'm going to say is that they've already been introduced. So I will once before. So what I will do is I'll briefly mention Helen. We're actually now back to her day job, which is as somebody who worries about energy at Clare College, Cambridge, and whose book, Disorder, there we are, is about how energy has affected the 20th century and about the energy transition. So if you are interested in the energy transition, I'm sure that will be important. On my left is Nick Butler, who was also introduced at an earlier session. He's gone through his own transition because he started in BP, actually on the sharp end of the energy market, and then ended up worrying about the transition itself with various government agencies, including Gordon Brown, who was mentioned so well earlier in one of the other sessions about what a great person he was. So there we are. And just briefly, I'm Tamin Bayoumi. I was for a long time at the IMF, and I'm chairing the session. And I actually know Paul from all the way back in college. So with no more ado, let's start with the first question, which is a pretty basic one, which is, we all think we know about the energy transition, but what exactly does it involve, and how big is it? And to give it some kind of context, maybe, how does it compare with the last big energy transition we had, which is after the oil crisis, when essentially Western industrial economies sort of saved on energy because energy's cost had gone up. Now, obviously, that was an economic transition. This one's got some political economy elements to it. But Nick, can you describe to us how big the problem is?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming to the session. Can I ask how many of you came here by car? How many of those cars are electric cars? This is what the energy transition is about at one level. And the fact that you have not yet made the transition is, though obviously an intelligent thinking audience where you wouldn't be in the room, is absolutely the state of the problem. The energy transition has hardly begun. It means if we're going to get to what is called net zero by 2050, or anywhere near that, people will have to shift how they use energy. It's not just about producing different sorts of energy, it's about how we all use it, which means moving to vehicles that don't rely on petrol, home heating systems that don't rely on gas, holidays that don't rely on flying around the world. And that transition has just not yet taken place. And it's not unique to the UK, this is true across Europe. When the climate change really came on the agenda in the early 1990s with the various reports from the UN panel on climate change, the energy mix across the world was about 85% oil, gas, and coal. That's fossil fuels, all of them sources of carbon emissions. The energy mix now is that oil, gas, and coal account for 82% of global energy demand at a much higher level because of all the economic growth that has taken place. And there is no immediate prospect of that changing radically, because this is down to the fundamental fact that the world we live in, embedded in the life we live, is the use of fossil fuels. In vehicles, in houses, in buildings, in aeroplanes, in industrial plant. And you can change it step by step. Some of it can be changed quite easily, but it's not been changed yet. So people do to come back to electric vehicles. There are now about 20 million electric vehicles worldwide, and it's going up. The latest figures show it goes up by about a third every year. So it'll be 30 million within the next 18 months. But there are 1.4 billion internal combustion engine vehicles around the world, and the number of internal combustion engine vehicles rises by more each year than the number of electric vehicles. So we have and there are more SUVs being sold than electric vehicles. We have a long, long way to go, and it's the problem is not just here. We think about these things in very local terms, and that does matter. But the UK is only about 1.2% of global emissions. So even if we had no emissions here, it wouldn't solve the global problem. Most of the problem now is the growth of population and prosperity in what used to be called the third world, in the emerging market economies of Asia and Africa. And they rely, because they can't afford expensive alternatives in many cases, they rely on coal as their main source of power in China, in India, parts of Africa. And so the scale of the change that is required, which is what I'm trying to illustrate, is absolutely enormous. It's equipment, it's demand, it's production, and they all have to be brought together at once, and that's not yet been done. You said the last energy transition was in the 1970s. I don't agree with that. I think the last energy transition was the transition from coal to oil 70 years ago. And that was profound, but it took decades to move away from coal. The previous transition was from wood to coal, in using coal as a source of power and industrial heat. That's about 1800. And it started in the UK and spread from there. So we have to think of this in a decades-long time set, and we should be absolutely aware of all the challenges that have to be dealt with, including poverty, including people's reluctance to spend now for the sake of future generations, including the embedded vested interests in not changing. So all those things matter. And you asked, the question is, the scale of transformation is enormous.
I agree entirely with Nick, but I'm going to put it somewhat differently. I say what the energy transition means is reinventing the entire material basis of our material civilization, because that's how much fossil fuel energy and all the infrastructure around fossil fuel energy has permeated. You might say that modernity, if we're going to use that language, is the application of fossil fuel energy. And so the idea that in what is now less than 30 years, we are essentially going to undo all that. Once you understand the scale of that, you realise just how highly unlikely it is that we're going to do that. Now, I think actually there's two things I would pull out from what Nick said about these past comparisons. One about the coal, oil, and then one about, I think there is an attempt at an energy transition in the 70s that fails. And coal oil is all that time in which oil is getting a bigger proportion and coal is coming down as proportion, and then I think it's in like the early 1960s at the aggregate world level that oil overtakes coal as a proportion. Coal is still going up. You're just adding energy sources, and that's what we're doing so far with the energy transition, is we're moving into a multiple energy source world. And what we're got to do, if we're going to do the energy transition in the terms in which we're talking about, is actually be replacing oil and gas, not simply having solar and wind generated electricity being added to the mix. And that brings something else in, because the energy transition, as it's generally being conceived, in which hydrogen's got a smaller part of the picture, is that you've not only got to replace energy sources, you've actually got to change from using mostly primary energy to using mostly secondary energy, so that's electricity. So it's decarbonising electricity plus then electrifying, all these things that have been done by primary energy. And if you then also think about the structure in energy terms of what's happening, is every energy transition that's gone on previously has basically been moving, with the possible exception of adding gas to the mix, which is a bit more complicated story, been moving from lower density energy to higher density energy. That means, like, for the volume of energy, that the energy is doing more work when it's higher density energy, if you want to put it quite simply, than lower density energy. This one, if you leave nuclear power out of it, involves going the other way. It means going from higher density energy to lower density energy. So there's no a priori reason whatsoever to think that lower density energy can recreate modern industrial civilization. Now, possibly it can, who knows? But the idea that it's a given that it can is a very strange starting assumption. I think if you go back to the 70s, it's interesting because I think that there is a whole reaction to the energy crises of the 1970s that for Western countries begin well before October 1973 and the Arab-Israeli war. So in the US, you're starting to have shortages in 1971. And that is because US domestic oil production pre-shale peaked in 1970. You've got that happening at the same time as the British are being pushed out of the Middle East, so Britain can no longer act basically as the guarantor of Western energy security in the Middle East. The Soviets have found the West Siberian hydrocarbon fields that become the basis of the post-1970s Soviet, then Russia, Europe energy relationship, particularly around gas. There's a lot of people in Western countries at the top who are basically saying, we're not going to be able to carry on as we are. And that's really what the limits to growth argument was basically saying, that the Club of Rome put out. Now, that was discredited in lots of ways for good reasons, because some of the arguments didn't work. But at the same time, it was an awareness of the fact that there was a resource and ecological constraint to economic growth that wasn't being reckoned with. And you see certain countries, I think in different ways in West Germany and in particularly perhaps consequentially the United States under Jimmy Carter, trying to do an energy transition. Remember, it was Jimmy Carter who put solar panels on the White House. First thing Ronald Reagan did when he came to office was pull them back down again. But you can see, if you listen to or go back and read the speeches that Jimmy Carter gave, it's like we do need to do an energy transition. The truth of the matter is, though, it became incredibly domestically difficult. He tried to do it, which is part of where it has to go in terms of saying you will have to make sacrifices in terms of present energy consumption to get to the future. And then he was considered a complete pessimist, fatalist who wasn't fit to be American president because he didn't understand that production was the American way of doing it. And I think we need to understand that we're not starting right now, or even in the 2010s, from doing this energy transition. It has, in terms of the attempt at it, history that goes back to the 1970s that hasn't been particularly successful. The Germans started it seriously in the late 1990s under the red-green government there. In January of 2020, Angela Merkel went to Davos and she said, we found it's a lot harder than we thought it was. And part of the problem is the sun doesn't shine very much in Germany and the wind doesn't blow very much. And there are other places where geographically it's a lot easier for them. So this is a history, and it's a difficult history that's already happened. And the reason why it's been difficult is for the reasons that Nick has said, is that the scale of what is required and the disruption of the status quo that is required in order to do it is extraordinary.
And that starts us off with some of the complications as to what will happen. I guess one of the questions which I have is we tend to think about this as advanced countries, but as Nick was mentioning, actually, coal and the rise in demand for energy is actually happening a lot in emerging countries. So I guess there are two questions. Firstly, who's responsible for what we've had now? How much is that really sort of the industrial countries, but how much is that? For example, China recently has been producing a lot. So sort of who's to blame? And the second thing is, given the nature of the transition, how much of this is poor countries who really will need subsidies to do it? And where on earth are we going to find the international cooperation to actually provide them with the funds that they need? So sorry, that was a long question. But.
Nick, you go first.
Who's to blame? We're all to blame because it is about how we use energy. And the driver of the growth in energy demand and therefore emissions over the last 50 years, when it's been at its fastest, is sheer population growth. So we have this session for, what, an hour? By the end of the hour, there will be almost 10,000 new citizens of the world every hour. So nearly 250,000 every day, nearly 90 million a year. And combine that with the spread of prosperity, particularly in emerging markets in India and so on, I think the calculation is that there are 200 million new consumers of commercial energy every year. And at the moment, they consume mostly fossil fuels. And that is the driver of the problem. Now, in the past, yes, the industrialized countries were the first emitters. The Industrial Revolution started here and then in Europe and then to the United States. But now that is dwarfed by the fact that China accounts for about 30% of all the emissions globally every day. And India, which is just following China, not yet at the same scale, is the next up. And that is where the emissions will come. And they use coal. And they use coal because it's the cheapest available source of fuel and because it is, in both countries, a domestic industry that sustains a lot of employment and wealth in provinces that would otherwise have no source of wealth. So you have to, and I don't think it'll be solved by subsidy because I don't see the Western countries, including sadly the UK, being in the mood to give a lot of aid to any other parts of the world. Most of the aid budget in this country is spent in this country, given to companies and agencies and consultancies that then work in around the world. I don't see a great drive to give more overseas aid. I think it'll only be solved by science. I think it will only be solved when we get a low-cost, low-carbon alternative that people in the emerging economies can use at their level of income and wealth. And that is not there yet, but I think that is the challenge. And to me, that is the most rational policy that any government can have on climate change. Because the problem is global. The problem is not just in the UK or Germany or France or the US. We can all do something. But the real problem is getting the poorer people of the world an option that allows them to develop, allows them to increase their living standards without destroying the climate.
So the answer isn't Tesla?
More possibly.
I think that it's really important to see how what we in the Western countries think we're asking of developing countries is, from their point of view, completely absurd. Because what we're basically saying is we are going to do this energy transition with the fossil fuel energy system that we have effectively as an insurance policy. So we're going to keep using it so long as we're not able to use it. That is our starting place. And what we're saying, including in the terms of some of the investment partnerships and aid that does happen to particularly the poorer countries, is you need to skip straight into the future. You don't get to do it the way that we've done it, via fossil fuel energy, like first, and keeping it in place until we can replace it. You just jump. They're not going to do that because everybody, I think, does understand that the energy transition depends upon technological progress that has not yet happened. That's why it's so important that it does happen. But it's a bet that is yet to be realised. Now, if you then have something that happens like the way in which Western countries, including our country here in the UK, responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in energy terms, you can see why this argument falls apart in terms of the one that we make to the global south countries. So if you recall, November 2021, it was the COP summit in Glasgow. There was a great deal of pressure placed on a group of countries, including India, China, Indonesia, to make a statement about a declaration about phasing out coal. I think it was by 2045, that they didn't want to sign up to, and a great deal of moral pressure was being put on them, including by obviously Boris Johnson's government, the Americans, to get them to do this. We get to February of 2022, we have what looks like an energy crisis for European countries. And what does a number of European countries, UK, Germany being two good examples, do to take three, in this country's case, coal-fired power stations that we're going to close and say we're keeping them open. So in the emergency, our energy source of last resort for electricity was coal. Just months after we'd been telling Indonesia and India, you're not going to use any coal. You talk to any people in the Indian officials about this, that's the point when they just say, we'll never listen to anything you say on this subject ever again, because the hypocrisy is just so astounding. And then, if you go further, and then you look at what happened in terms of the demand for liquid natural gas, so that's the gas that's shipped across seas, in the wake of the invasion, where Germany in particular, which had no liquid natural gas ports when Russia invaded, basically muscled its way through being able to pay into the LNG market, the liquid natural gas market. And a country like Pakistan, which had had long-term contracts for liquid natural gas from both American and Qatari companies for some time, was basically forced out of the market because it was more profitable for the companies to break the contracts, pay the penalties, and then sell the gas to Germany in the spot market. Now, if you're Pakistan in the face of that, and then you have a financial crisis in Pakistan, and also flooding happens at the same time, is your reaction to that is going to be we're going to burn some more coal. And so, in that sense, we have to understand that actually it isn't just about what's going on in terms of the energy transition. It's actually how that then interacts with the existing energy regime, the fossil fuel energy regime. And so long as we in Western countries just say we're holding on to what we've got, we use the fact that we're wealthier, particularly in the effectively structural competition for gas that takes place at times when gas becomes much more expensive, to our advantage. We can't expect to change the way in which anybody in the global south thinks about these questions.
Well, I think we've moved on to, I was going to come to the naivety of certain things, but I think we've started to. What I'd like to do, though, is maybe drill down on a couple of cases to see what the real sort of constraints are. And I was going to ask you to talk about Germany, which you've already mentioned a bit, but with the traffic light coalition, which clearly had energy transition as central to it, and it seems to run into a heck of a lot of roadblocks, including the German Constitutional Court messing up the way that they were going to finance it. So I thought that might be something to talk about, and also just people disliking it. I mean, European farmers out on the streets. And then I also want to talk maybe a bit about China, because you hear two stories about China, right? The first one is the one that you've both mentioned. They're opening all these coal power plants. The other one you hear is that they are actually quite advanced in the transition. And, it may be simply that the demand for power is going up so fast that they can do both at the same time. But I'd like to kind of have some resolution of those two stories that I hear separately but never try?
They're
hear
both,
somebody
they're
try-
both true.
Okay.
China is the world leader in renewable production. It produces an awful lot of the solar panels that are used right around the world. It's part of their plan to be the world's industrial powerhouse. They produce more electric vehicles. I think 80% of all the electric vehicles in the world are in China. They are doing long-distance grid technology, which can transmit electricity with limited losses over 3,000 kilometers. But they're also still using, I think it's more than 50% of all the coal that's used in the world every day is used in China. And this is a country that has grown by, I think the figure is about 6 or 8% a year for the last 40 years. It has 1.3 billion people, many of whom, 500 million of whom have been brought out of pretty much absolute poverty over that period. And the first thing you use when you come out of poverty is energy. And so they're doing both. And I don't think you're going to see that change. I think they are making great progress. They're now an industrial power. They're now a technical power as well. But I don't see them giving up on coal anytime soon. Germany is a different story. Germany is thought of as a world leader on being green. But if you look at the actual figures, they too get 80% of their energy from fossil fuels. And a third of that comes from coal. And the coal industry, though they keep planning its decline and fall, is still there. And it is a very embedded force in particular parts of Germany. And that has not changed despite the desire of repeated, successive governments to move away from it. Coal is still embedded in the economy. They're trying to move to more wind. The wind, as you say, doesn't always blow in Germany, so they set out a plan to have 2% of the whole land area using wind power. And that has met with a wave of local opposition. And they're now having to build, and they won't meet those the targets they have. They're now building wind farms in the North Sea to get towards their target. But the real problem in Germany now is the problem we have in this country as well, which is broken public finances. The move to the energy transition is expensive. It requires public subsidy to encourage people to invest and to encourage consumers to shift how they use energy. And almost all the European countries now have debt that is 90 or 100% of GDP because of COVID, because of the expenditure that was put into the economy to sustain economic life through COVID. The debt levels are very high. I think it was said last night by this 10% of our public spending in this country goes on paying debt interest, not the principal, just the interest every year. And therefore, the money is not available in Germany and many other countries to do what they'd like to do. And so these are real constraints that, yes, the Constitutional Court has said they can't borrow more, they can't reallocate the funding from other budgets. But in the end, public finance is not available to do what is needed to meet the net zero objectives that people are setting.
On China, I think it's most clearly stated in a way how the bits fit together in terms of what happened in the autumn of 2021 when there already was underway a significant gas price shock for European and Asian countries that was being driven by the big increase in China's demand for gas and liquid natural gas in particular during the course of that year. I think it went up, I think the Chinese demand for liquid natural gas went up 15% in the course of 2021. And then there were some internal problems to do with the electricity industry and the way that they were dealing with moving away from coal, that meant in September of 2021, the Chinese government ordered the industrial rationing of electricity. And the message went out from the top to the energy ministry, like, get energy sources, all energy sources by whatever means possible. I haven't quite got that's not quite the right wording, but it's pretty much that was what the message went out. And that sums up, to me, the way that the Chinese leadership thinks about energy questions. It doesn't do we'll think about the energy question, energy transition, and we'll think about fossil fuel energy, and we'll think about the problems that the Malacca Strait posed to us in the case of a war against Taiwan, or over Taiwan, I should say. It does everything at the same time. It's like they have ingrained thinking at a systems level, I would say, about thinking about energy that is generally absent in Western countries. Perhaps it's there a little bit in the United States, but I think in European countries, we just don't think about energy with the sophistication, actually, that the Chinese leadership thinks about it. We turn things into binary questions that they don't. They're very, very pragmatic, but also thinking about how all the different bits fit together. I think on the German question, in addition to we're just really pushing Nick's thought a little bit further, I think what's interesting on the finance of it side is that actually Germany's debt to GDP ratio, I think is somewhere in the 60%, somewhere between 60 and 70%, compared to 100 for us, 110 for the French, 140 for the Italians. So the Germans are actually in a better position in terms of having fiscal capacity, in principle, to spend money on the energy transition than we are. The debt break that they entrenched into their constitution is of their own doing, and that's what then the German Constitutional Court has said is a constraint on the way that they created this fund that they've shifted from the pandemic to energy transition, and have been told that they can't do it. But the difficulty I think the German government has in dealing with where it now finds itself is that the traffic light coalition, so the coalition between the Social Democrats, the Free Democrats and the Greens, is so bitterly divided to the point I'd say that it's paralysing that government about a whole range of issues, and this is one of them, because the Free Democrats won't even contemplate the idea of changing the debt break in order to deal with joining up the fiscal capacity issue with the energy transition. The Greens are very much in favour of doing that. The Social Democrats are a bit stuck in the middle. But the problem is that it's very difficult, given the divisions in Germany and in German society that are now manifesting in German politics, to have coalitions that can govern Germany that have essentially fewer than three parties in them. Or you have to have a grand coalition of the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats that does not look capable of sustaining itself, and not least because of the damage each time that the Social Democrats have done that to themselves in doing that. So it isn't just actually the fiscal capacity, it's how it then reacts with the German political situation. And then it gets on to the question of the fact that there's been this breakdown, if you like, in the alignment between the monetary world, the international monetary world and financial world in which net zero was conceived, the 2010s, the world of quantitative easing and zero interest rates. That's not the world in which we live in now. There's much more risk around debt, as Edward was talking about last night, than there was then. But we're also living in a different geopolitical world. So Germany doesn't just have to decide what to do with the fiscal capacity that I think it does have compared with us or the French. It has to decide, what does the energy transition matter in terms of the investment and the money we might spend in relation to what we're going to do about Russia, and whether we need to rearm in the face of Russia. So the choices of the energy transition brings for governments have just got so much more complicated than when the net zero projects were conceived in the latter part of the last decade.
And to take it one step further, I think I agree with everything you said, but I think it also, what's happening in Germany and what's happening here as well, reveals that for the mass of the population, this is not the top priority issue. It is one issue among many. For some people, it is the burning issue. For most people, it is an issue for the future. And it is because there isn't that broad public political support for action that action is not being taken. Governments have to concentrate on other more immediate things, and that's what they are doing. And you see it with the current government here, you see it in right across the EU now. And there was, I think, a peak of public support for action on climate change 2-3 years ago, and I think that that has now clearly declined. There is a strong belief among a minority, I think it's about 20% on the polls, for whom this is the only issue. For the rest of the population, people care about the health service, people care about education systems and social care, and so many other things. And unless the sense of urgency is re-established, we're not going to make the transition that needs to be made.
So talking about that, I guess, one's reminded of the tragedy of the commons, that, here we have a common good, which is, CO2 in the air, and nobody wants to actually change it. I'm reminded in this of sort of Jared Diamond and collapse, that a lot of cultures actually disintegrate for ecological reasons. So I guess I've got a twofold question. The first is, apart from possibly a huge technological change, is there any likelihood that the world will actually stagger towards a solution? Or are we going to go through something pretty climactic? And the second is, if you were God, how would you do it?
I think if I were God, I'd resign.
Well, you're advising government, so you clearly haven't chosen that choice.
I certainly wouldn't rely on God. How would you I don't think there is an alternative to a science solution. I think there's been an illusion over the last 30 years that we're going to get world government, that through the COP process, the endless annual negotiations, which now is a travelling circus going from Glasgow to Dubai, now to Brazil, to Azerbaijan, that you're going to get a solution where all the countries agree. This, to me, smacks of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was a very well-intentioned body set up after the First World War, which was to create peace, to establish peace and international cooperation. And it kept meeting and calling for peace right up until, I think, the end of 1939. And it was impossibly worthy and really not effective. And I think the COP process assumes that there is going to be a similar coming together of countries across the world, but countries don't have common interests on this. They should do, if you go to the global commons. But that is not how national governments think. And I think I would advocate a coalition of the willing around science to get towards a solution. That's a bet. It is not proven, as Helen said earlier, that we're not at that point yet, but I think that is the way forward. And I think at the same time, we should also accept a degree of adaptation. Climate change is not something that will happen in 2050 or 2100. It's clearly happening already with extreme weather. This is not a limited, gradual increase to 2 degrees above industrial temperatures. It's not going to be, it's climate disruption, and we need to be prepared to deal with that, which means protecting different areas that are at most risk, very low-lying countries like Bangladesh, parts of the European coastline, parts of our coastline. I think we should think in those terms. We are not going to stop it in the timescale that we're talking about. We can't postpone it, so I think we should do what we can in terms of science and be prepared to adapt to a reality that is already changing.
On that last point, I 100% agree, and I think that I know it's boring, we keep agreeing, but I think that in some ways the energy transition, in the way in which it's been turned by some people, only by some people, into a utopian project, has got in the way of that reality. Because it's kind of like something that's very justified in terms of very future orientated, another version of, if you like, technological modernity, and then it blinds us to the fact that actually we have to adapt in the present to something that is already with us and is not going away. I think in terms of your question, Tam, about the global commons and why, if we've got common interests as human beings on the planet, we can't do better with this. I think a significant part of the answer is because we don't have common energy interests. So we have common climate interests, and even that, you've got to put some qualifications in, because if you're in Bangladesh, it's a very different position than if you're in certain inland bits of Northern Europe. But when it comes to energy interests, we just don't, because this is where it's really important to see that fossil fuel energy history has just shaped human societies and human cultures in really radically different ways. And you can't separate out the European history of empire from that story. And if you just take Europe itself, you can see this really clearly in that all the early moves towards European integration had an energy component there. Coal and steel community in 1950, dealing with the fact that coal and iron deposits were fundamental to the French-German conflict from the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 all the way through to the Second World War. You take that away. Treaty of Rome, 1957, one part of it was the creation of the European Atomic Energy Community. Even the common market part of it, the French wanted Algeria in the common market because they wanted Algerian oil to be sold within the West European market. It was creating a unified market for that. The energy transition is being sold now as a new European unifying energy project for quite understandable reasons, including trying to end Europe's external energy dependency. But you look at the two states that are at the centre of the European Union, France and Germany, they are in radically different positions where energy is concerned. They don't have common energy interests. Germany wants to do the energy transition on the electric side via solar and wind. That means a completely different set of metals are required in order to build the infrastructure from that. France wants to do it via nuclear power, which means uranium is central to that. So even if you just try to say what's the priority strategically for Europe's resource engagement with the rest of the world, you get a completely different answer if you look at it in Paris than you look at it in Berlin. And then if you look at the fact of how then the EU itself incentivizes businesses to deal with the energy transition, because they're not doing it the same way, you can't get a common EU policy. If you talk to anybody involved in European Union energy decision-making over the last few years, they'll tell you that this Franco-German standoff over nuclear power is practically paralysed EU energy decision-making in terms of the energy transition. And we're just talking about countries here where the actual per capita energy consumption is pretty much comparable with each other. Once you start bringing in then countries where the per capita energy consumption is so much lower than it is for us, the idea that there are common energy interests, again, it's not there. And so the best hope that we have, which in a way, I'd say modern industrial civilization has always been a bet on technology. It's always been a bet on technology getting out of these messes, and it has often done that. I mean, think about artificial nitrogen and being able to do that, fertilizers. How many more people are alive in the world today because of technology being able to sort out the problem of how to do fertilizer? Now, that doesn't mean there haven't been ecological consequences to that too. But the fact that we're in a kind of race with how far we can technologically advance in order to solve our resource constraint and ecological degradation problems. I'd say that's always been the modern world. That's been there right since the start of it. So in that sense, this has got a history too. And whilst the stakes are now perhaps higher than ever, science has got us out of some of these holes before.
We should let the audience very quickly before you let the audience join the conversation. One more point on adaptation, which I think will really shape the debate in the next few years, is the geographic difference in the impact of climate change. If you look at the studies, the latest studies, they suggest that the greatest impact will be on the line above the equator. And that will come first. The change will not be uniform. It affects that area, North Africa, through the Middle East, through northern Central Asia. And the risk there is that temperatures go up to the level that makes whole areas uninhabitable. And this is the next migration crisis. Not driven by political instability or ISIS or anything like that, but by simple inability to live, to grow crops, to find water in an area of the world that has a lot of people. And with modern technology and their ability to watch what's happening elsewhere, the potential for a serious move to Europe, a serious migration, much more than anything we've seen, is very real.
Well, on that happy note, I will open it up and let's have three to start off with. You, I think, were out of the, and then maybe back here. And then finally, let's make it you, and then we will move on from there.
Every energy transition has been underwritten by fuels with a higher energy potential. I think the Chinese have got 60 nuclear power stations on order in 2 or 3 different styles. Why are the Americans not competing with that?
Do we want to answer them?
No, let's take three. Let's take a few.
Yeah, I was thinking.
Hi. You mentioned that you didn't think that subsidies were the answer, that subsidies wouldn't come. So, we know that we're not going to get the carrot as a solution for this. Do you think the stick in the form of carbon border mechanisms to essentially blockade goods which have a high carbon content could be part of the solution?
Had a question on nuclear power, so maybe we'll split it. Mine was just that we already seem to try an energy transition that failed towards a higher density energy. Is there any lessons that we can take away to apply this time? How about you?
Well, yes, it was the fact that, given that we are dealing here with compromise and not ideals, even the environmentalist James Lovelock himself, some time ago now, I remember saying that we should be transitioning to nuclear power as soon as possible. What are your reactions to that?
Let's take all these nuclear questions together, because I think that they've got a common answer in a way. I think it is really important to see that in the middle of the 1950s, and in Europe particularly after the Suez crisis, and the shock of the Suez crisis, which was experienced not just in Britain and France, but in Germany, West Germany, too, the big hope was nuclear power. And that's the context of the European Atomic Energy Community as part of the Treaty of Rome. And if you go back and look at the speeches that were made by the president of the European Atomic Energy Community, even into the early 60s, you can see a lot of this, what I would describe as utopian language now about net zero, featuring in this language about what nuclear power is going to do and how it's going to end Europe's resource dependency. And at that point, there's still the hope that nuclear power will be used directly, so it can be a direct substitution for oil, and not just for generation of electricity. And the nuclear power then story keeps growing and growing in terms of in one sense, the technological optimism attached to it. It's fueled by the 1973 oil price shock, and a little bit earlier than that, in terms of the US. And then what happens if you look at the story of like the Western countries, as at a certain point, everybody else starts to pull back from it in terms of expansion of it. And it's not just the Germans. The Germans are just the ones who first commit in the late 90s and then again with Merkel in 2011 to end it. And the French stand out. The French are the ones that are different. The French like say, no, we're all in nuclear power and we're staying there. So the Americans are one of the ones that pull away. So I think you then have to say is well, what's going on here? And I think part of the answer is that the French, let's put it differently. Part of the answer is that nuclear power turns out to be extremely expensive, and extremely expensive for the state. That it's not possible to get the private sector to do as much of the heavy lifting around nuclear power as might have been like hope. The French are committed enough in a way, I always slightly back off now from saying this, but something about the vanity of the French state, I think, that keeps them in like the nuclear power game, the willingness to just like absorb the costs and to turn it into a symbol of the French state's like technological like prowess. So the Americans, I think, pull away in the same reasons that others pull away, including us. And then what's happened is that hopes there were, which I think were there in the early 2000s. You can see it in the Blair government's, I think it's at 2004, they put out an energy strategy document, which basically says, look, we can not end nuclear power like Germany, but the future is solar and wind. So we don't need to do an expansion of like nuclear power. And the reason why we're back to it is because solar and wind have not solved the intermittency issue by this point, when the hope in the early 2000s, I think, was that it was. I don't think that and this goes back to what I said earlier about like the Chinese, they're always doing everything in energy joined up at the same time, less binary thinking, less utopian hopes attached to it. And so they never took themselves out of or they never got into that it's nuclear versus wind and solar. So now everybody else, including us, I think the Americans are playing catch up.
Well, there are some efforts to play catch up. I'm not sure they're terribly credible. I think the alternative way of looking at this is that nuclear power stations produce electricity. Electricity accounts for just 20% of final energy demand. That might grow. It's not growing yet. But I think the energy transition has to focus more on the other 80%. Now, nuclear's had a bad history in this country, particularly Hinkley, which is years and years behind schedule and billions over budget. I think the technical lead that the French used to have has gone. And I would put some money, and I think the government might do it on Wednesday in the budget, into small modular nuclear reactors, which Rolls-Royce and other people are doing. I think that's workable, but I don't think nuclear is the solution because it doesn't deal with the other 80% of final energy demand. And hydrogen might do that, I'm not sure. That too is expensive, but I don't think it'll be nuclear.
Solar and wind only produce electricity as well.
Yes, they only, but no, they do, but they're cheaper than nuclear. And I think if we have breakthroughs on energy storage, so you store the electricity, that's, I think, will be the next technical step in the energy industry. That will change the economics of wind and solar, because at the moment you can only use the power they create in the instant. If you could store it, that would make them, you could get a factor of 4 or 5 in terms of productivity. And that's very interesting.
On the carbon border adjustment like tax, I think that this is where Europe again has got some like difficulties because on the one hand, the European response, and I'm including us in this, I don't mean this in the EU, is basically to say to the Americans about the Inflation Reduction Act, it's so protectionist. We shouldn't be doing like the energy transition in this way, and it's going to mean a shift of investment capital into the United States and those countries that the United States has a free trade area with. But so is this what the EU wants to do about the basically about a carbon border tax. And it then raises the question of like, well, is it going to be acceptable to those parts of the world where we have basically shunted energy-intensive industrial production, then to basically put a tariff on those industrial goods coming back? And again, I don't think that that kind of like adds up as a way of dealing with the international divisions between highly industrialized economy or high per capita energy consumption societies, let's call them that, and the global south. And some of those things, in terms of like energy intensive production, like take semiconductor, for example, there is no alternative, as we know, on advanced semiconductor chips, but to be buying them from Taiwan. And then we're going to say that we're going to tax them because you use the Taiwanese, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company uses coal in order to produce those advanced chips. I don't think so, because we can't do without them, because 90% of the advanced chips are being made in Taiwan.
I think we have time for one more question. The front row has been doing well, so I think I'll the chap right back there, yes, who got his hand up first.
Thank you. You've been speaking a lot about the West, China and India, but you've not spoken much about the actual oil and gas producing countries, and in particular Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is apparently transitioning its economy away from oil, pushed towards tourism and other industries. Do you think this is born out of a kind of autocrat's passion project, or it is genuine long-term thinking from a country that doesn't have to worry about short-term problems like elections?
I think it is long-term thinking from McKinsey's, which is a consulting firm, who are making an absolute fortune out of the Saudis by selling them this nonsense. I don't see a rush of people wanting to go on holiday in Saudi Arabia. I must ask my wife if she's ready to put on her burqa. No, I think it is. If you look at the numbers, Saudi Arabia is still almost 100% dependent on oil and gas revenue. They may have a few Red Sea diving resorts, but I don't think it's a fundamental change.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that if you look at Saudi football as the other side of this, you've already got players wanting to come back. I mean, the idea that this was, I think, that the Saudis could really create a league that would compete with the European leagues and get them into the Champions League, which is obviously the point of the project. I mean, something radically would have to change, I think, for that to be the case. I think what is also true, though, is that even if you, let's say for the sake of argument, that in 10 years' time, the world's got down to using 80 million barrels of oil a day rather than about 103. That's probably on the optimistic side. But I want it to be optimistic for a reason. Who do we think is going to be producing 80 million barrels of oil a day? The Saudis are still going to be in the top 3 players. In fact, if you move this time frames on a bit longer, they're going to get ahead of the Americans again, because without new shale fields in the US shale boom is going to have played itself out by then. So whatever scenario you're looking at, the Saudis are still going to be players, big players in the oil market in 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 years time. And so the actual incentive for them to say, we must adjust our economy, even when you take account of the fact that they don't have to worry about elections in a few years' time, it's not overwhelming, I don't think, from their point of view.
Part of the foreign policy push to make sure everyone wants to keep buying from them. So you've got all this other stuff like football, so lovely, ignore.
That's the argument, but I'm not sure it's convincing yet. I think the greenwashing of sport is meeting quite a lot of resistance. it's seen for what it is.
Well, I started this session, I'm not an expert on the energy transition. I started this session as chair thinking that things were bad, and I've now ended this session by thinking things are impossible. So I don't know whether that's progress or not, but I've ended up very depressed.